Hi, everybody. Welcome to Tough to Treat. This is Susan Clinton, one of your co-hosts for the podcast. This is actually going to be a two-part podcast from a webinar that I did on breath, voice, and HRV as predictors and interventions into pelvic health. This podcast is in two parts. So the first part is airing today, September 14th, and the next part two, will be airing on September 21st. In this podcast, we're really going to be looking at getting beyond that regional approach of the pelvic floor and really understand how discovering and addressing dysfunctions of the trigeminal and respiratory system, including the voice and heart rate variability, can have impact on pelvic health. Heart rate variability is a well-researched indicator of the balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. This balance has a large impact on the performance of the GI system and can influence pain, motility, and inflammation. Working with breath, voice, and HRV can not only predict dysfunction, but is an excellent metric to guide interventions into different domains. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. This is part one, and part two will be next week on September 21st. Thank you. So, how does respiration get messed up? We talked a lot about, obviously, if you're ill, if you have asthma, if you have breathing disorder problems, that can be a part of it. People who are in bed a lot, can start losing their respiration in good ways. But, of course, pregnancy is a big one, right? There's a rising of the baby out of the pelvic brim, and with it, it pushes the organs to the back and it moves the diaphragm up. And it makes us have to breathe differently. Our rib cage has to move backwards and respond, or else we'll fall forward over onto our noses. So we want to think about that it may be compromised. And oftentimes we don't have a great return of this unless it's trained a little bit. And I'll show you a picture later on that will make sense to you as to why. But the brain sets this up. It sets up this new movement pattern because it's got to figure out a way for us to breathe. That's its number one priority. Number two, keeping the heart beating. And then number three, finding something to drink, and then finding something to eat. It's the ABCs of CPR. What's the first thing? Airway. It's important. So it's going to set us up to breathe in any way that it can. And once it does that, it doesn't go back unless there's a reason. Remember, we just talked about the pelvic floor moving during respiration. And it's primarily concentric with expiration, or in other words, a lift, and it's hardwired to work with the deep abdominal muscle system. So when we have faulty breathing patterns, which means maybe we are overdoing the scaling work and we're not really using the pump handle and the lateral movement, the bucket handle, the diaphragm isn't working well. This is things that, can happen over time. And when we don't have those nice, good breaths and things like that, and we're having these faulty, shorter, breaths that are going on, it really drives change in our respiratory and chemistry and pH. It makes us more acidotic. It triggers smooth muscle constriction, because when we're in a state of acidosis, what are we fixing to do? Run from the tiger, turn around and fight, right? And then, or freeze. And boy, do we really need to have smooth muscle constriction going on when we freeze, because we want to be invisible. So that leads to electrolyte imbalance, decreased tissue oxygenation, of course, of certain things, an over-oxygenation, perhaps maybe of some of the skeletal muscles to help us move and fight or run, but also certainly an increased excitability of the nervous systems and the muscles. The interesting thing about this is allostatic load of stress does the same thing. So it doesn't have to be in response of physical threat. It could be in response to any kind of threat that our system sees. And so we want to think about, how does that set up in the body, and what is the physiology and what is the function of the work there? And there was a great article in 2017 that exposed women to various types of what they would consider visuals of threats. And for the ones that were really, looking at things in a very threatening, looking at threatening situations, they all had a concomitant response to their pelvic floors. So it makes a lot of sense when we look at this, but that goes for the guys too. It doesn't change. So in 2006, Maggie Smith and Paul Hodges' group did a big study. And one of the big things that they cross-matched women across Australia for gender and race and height and weight and age and all kinds of things. And they found not only was there a stronger association with back pain and obesity with breathing pattern problems than anything else. And they also found that back pain had a high association with GI dysfunction. No surprise there to all of us who follow the literature and realize that a lot of GI dysfunction comes from a nervous system that is not regulated well. So, and also Perry in 2003, these are older literatures, but they're foundational pieces, have stronger associations with cervical pain, faulty breathing patterns. So what does that tell me? Kind of like, if we can intervene here, maybe, and not just give lip service to this, but teach people how to and we'll get into this with the HRV, what's the best breathing pattern for our buck that we can do that's going to decrease their allostatic load, but also change some of this stuff and have an effect on this stuff, along with the other things that we do as well. So let's dig into the diaphragm just a little bit here. We talked about the negative pressure in the chest to draw air in, as it's a primary respiratory muscle, and then it returns the airflow. And the other real important thing that the diaphragm needs to do is clear the airway. We need to be able to cough and sneeze. And it's super important that we do that. And one of the things, in order to effectively clear the airway, we really need to have a forward head. So if you are working with somebody who has incontinence or they have back pain, one of the things that I would, and I'm just picking those to kind of simplify all of this here, but I asked them to show me, how do you cough and how do you sneeze? I asked them to show that to me. They kind of look at me like I'm a little strange, but hey, it's me, let's go with it. And what they all do is because society tells us not to share our germs, right? They all drop their head into their chest and they cough and all the pressures go downward. Same thing with the sneeze, they withdraw in, flex down and sneeze. And where's the pressure going? It's not coming up and out. So it's not an effective way to clear the airway. So what we need people to do is actually have a forward head and a bit of an open mouth. Now, you can still cover. You can cover with, your whatever you have, your elbow, your hands, you can still cover. You don't want to spray your stuff everywhere, but you really need to clear the airway for an effective cough or sneeze. And if you want your pelvic floor to start working better with that, set the system up for success. Have the person sway slightly forward to recruit the posterior chain a little bit better, and drop, bring that head a little bit forward and sneeze and cough, and see if they aren't much more effective in clearing their airways. This is stuff we did in ICU, and then when I was on the rehab unit forever, we did a lot of this stuff, and it was all getting behind them and with their head and just really teaching them how to position so they could clear their airway more effectively. And, it really, really made a huge difference. So the diaphragm also needs to match the demands of the activity. So if we're quiet talking to yelling, our diaphragm is going to have a very different movement pattern, right? You can only imagine with yelling, the air we need to move up through our chest and out of our airway enough to rattle those vocal cords and produce that sound needs to be quite different from quiet talking. If normal lifting, like moving our body out of a chair, out of the bed, off on the floor, up and down stairs, we really shouldn't have to use our diaphragm as a postural control muscle there. If our clients are doing that, then they're falling into compression. They're working very, very hard for things that humans should be able to do easily. So we may need to use more diaphragm strategies of breath holding if we're working into the, above our, getting closer to PRing at our 1 rep max. That's going to be where we need to do that a lot more. But for normal lifting and normal walking around and normal stuff, we shouldn't have to rely on our diaphragm as a postural control muscle. We should be able to recruit the system to work better. And then finally, the diaphragm is going to be the primary mover of the internal organs. So it kind of works almost like a sump pump. I didn't know what a sump pump was till we moved up here to Michigan, and everyone has one. And so my husband showed me how it worked, and it was like, oh, that's what the diaphragm does. So it pushes down on the visceral organs, and then it actually, as it comes up, it lifts the pleural lining up with it. And so the organs actually get kind of sucked back up into a different position. And this goes on with every breath. So if our diaphragm isn't acting as a primary respiratory muscle, we're not getting great movement, mechanical movement of our internal organs. And think about how that's going to look with chronic conditions and things. Okay, so then there was a great article in 2012 by Kohler. And one of the things that they did was they looked at the position of the diaphragm, and they looked at the pattern that the diaphragm had as far as like the angle that it was in and what its excursion looked like on functional MRI. And they did this with people laying flat on their back. I wish they had done it with them standing up, but they did it flat on their back. And they actually they resisted like a 12-inch off the bed straight leg raise and a 12-inch off the bed straight arm raise. And then they just looked to see what was the difference of the diaphragm. And so what they found was that when they applied the resistance with people without pain, they had a really normal excursion. There was a lifting up and back of the diaphragm, but what they also found was with people with chronic low back pain, they actually started off with a much more excurged diaphragm towards their spine. So in other words, the crust was lifted and pulled back towards the spine before they even started. It had less movement with respiration, and it really was exaggerated when they had to work against the resistance. So quite a bit of difference there when we have chronic low back pain. And what that does to the recruitment, of the diaphragm. It wasn't free to work well as a postural, as a respiratory muscle. It was really working hard as a postural control muscle. And I don't know, is that because with pain, certain muscles get inhibited and certain muscles have to over-recruit? Is that a brain protection thing? We're not real sure, but we do know in chronic low back pain, the multifidi muscles are inhibited. And so without the multifidi there to support the spine, is the diaphragm coming backwards to hang on there. So this is just a picture, just to remind everybody of the different structures that we have going on. And this is the area that we're talking about. So there's a lot of implications for the viscera. The pelvic floor will be right in here. But just remembering how much that diaphragm really covers inside the rib cage. And so as it pulls and breathes, there's this outward movement, outward and up movement, right, of the lower ribs. And then up in front, there's a lifting, a bucket handle lifting that actually lifts and pulls and changes the pressure so the diaphragm can work much more efficiently. On top of that, don't forget we have pectoralis muscles, and we've got serratus muscles that come in, and we've got intercostal muscles all in here that all need to coordinate up and work again. And they're going to work if everything is being held very still, and the only thing moving is the belly, right? We need to have a coordinated movement and quiet breathing of the chest as well as the belly. Now, there are times when we're doing certain exercise programs and patterns that we want the belly to work more. And there are times when we want the chest wall to work more. The two examples I can think of are yoga and Pilates. So Pilates is going to want a stronger contraction of the abdominal musculature and much more of a work through the chest wall. And, yoga tends to kind of like bring in the belly a little bit more. But overall, if we want to bring people down to what I call baseline, all the way down, as low as we can get it without neural tension, without postural muscles overworking, we want them to be able to lie on their back in a comfortable position for their head and their airway and have a nice, normal, equal, quiet movement of the chest and the belly moving equally. We don't want one moving more than the other. We want to really help them kind of get to where, can you get it to where it's just as quiet on both ends, and can it be as easy so that you're not struggling as much? It may take putting a pillow under the head as well as the shoulders a little bit, putting a pillow under the knees to remove the neural tension from the legs, finding that position where they can actually access both levels, the belly and the chest wall, so that that diaphragm can actually work in all the positions it needs to work. And then, of course, I teach it to them as they go to sit up, as they go to stand up, because we want to be able to, when we're not needing to work so hard, we want to be able to use that as a retest. Can I check in and see where this is? Or am I, like, what's happening? Is my chest so tight that it's not breathing? Why am I so stressed? It's a nice way to check into the system and see what's going on. Another reason that I spend a lot of time with the diaphragm is, we have to remember the other neurological innervations that it's connected with. Obviously, the diaphragm has the phrenic nerve, but it also has, the regional nerves from, about T5 to T12, L1, L2 can all have some input into the diaphragm. Those are things that also share innervations with the iliolumbar ligament, with the psoas, and the ilioinguinal and hypogastric and genitofemoral nerves of the abdominal wall, and the femoral nerve superior, and the cluneal nerves, the dorsal nerves. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. And there's a lot of differentials in there. Is anterior hip pain because of an impingement, or is it because of a T12L1 referral pattern that's happening? Is the iliolumbar ligament really tender and really dysfunctional, or is it because it's a referral pattern, or what's happening there? And if we get the diaphragm moving and we can restore rotation to the region, oftentimes we can make a difference in how all of this stuff happens, because all of these things need to move. So if we have an area in our body where there's not a lot of movement going on, that's not healthy for any of these nerves, because nerves are bloodsuckers. They require movement, and they require all of that in order to be as healthy as possible. And remember that every nerve runs up and down with an artery and a vein, and a lymph drainage system, to take out the trash. So the more movement we have and the less compression we're in through our spine, like we're not falling into compression, we've got some decent movement, the healthier all of these things are going to be. And one of the best ways to get some movement through here is breath, and really looking at that and then really building on it. So also remember that the psoas is important, but think about it more as a trunk muscle versus a hip flexor posterior pelvic rotator. So its real job is to side bend to the same side and rotate to the opposite side. And this has been demonstrated time and time again. When people sit on their pelvis and don't use their legs, they can actually pick up that pelvis and move it like they're walking on their pelvis. That all comes from the psoas musculature. Runners who are doing like high knee running, your sprinters and your the ones that glide over the brackets and the things like that, they're thin, but you can see their psoas muscles underneath their abdominal wall. They're big, they're large, they're hypertrophied from the work that they do. So the more it involves hip flexion plus that side bending rotation that we have when we run, really requires a lot of strength there. And so all of this stuff works together and is really very important. And if this isn't working well, you can imagine that, if the genitofemoral nerve or the ilioinguinal, are hypersensitive or under neural tension because they haven't moved in a while, or they haven't moved on one side in a while, or whatever may have been happening, that could be a source of irritation, that if it's not handled at the neural tension level and the rotational level, as well as the breathing level, we're not going to get complete changes for our clients.